Cancel his rehab. Save the money. The words slid into the hospital room as cleanly as a blade sliding between two ribs, and though my body could not so much as flinch, something inside me went perfectly still. My wife was still holding my hand. To anyone passing the doorway, she would have looked like devotion made flesh, a faithful woman keeping vigil over her broken husband, her thumb tracing slow circles against my knuckles. Then she leaned close enough that her breath warmed the shell of my ear and lowered her voice to the register people reserve for secrets. All that money for therapy when he'll probably never recover anyway. It's pointless. My chest did not ache from the fractured ribs then. It ached from something the doctors had no name for. A second voice answered, lazy, amused, the voice of a man already spending an inheritance that wasn't his. I'll take the house on the lake. A soft laugh. I've wanted to remodel that place for years. The garage alone is worth more than most people's homes. And my wife, my Eleanor, laughed with him. A light, private, comfortable laugh and said, we'll wait until everything's official. Neither of them noticed the single tear that escaped the corner of my eye and ran down into my hair. They believed I could not hear them. They believed I could not understand them. And most dangerous of all, for them, they believed I could not remember. They were wrong on every count. Before I take you any further into the strangest month of my life, let me say one small thing. If stories about ordinary people surviving extraordinary betrayal mean something to you, stay with me to the end. The real lesson isn't where you think it is. Now, let me tell you how a silent man in a hospital bed learned to speak loudly enough to be heard in a room of 400. My name is Walter Hensley. I am 63 years old, and until 3 days before that whispered conversation, I believed I had built the kind of life most people only allow themselves to imagine on the drive home from work. I built neighborhoods. Not glass towers in Manhattan, not casinos in the desert. Neighborhoods, the ordinary miracles where a school teacher and a firefighter and a retired couple could put down roots and afford a porch to grow old on. For nearly 35 years across North Carolina, I left the house before the sun and came home long after it had gone. I was not born to any of it. My father drove a delivery truck until his hands shook. My mother cleaned motel rooms off the highway outside Charlotte and came home smelling of bleach and other people's lives. Everything I owned had been earned, one poured foundation at a time, including the 3-story stone house that looked out over Lake Hartwell. People assumed I loved that house because it was expensive. The truth was quieter than that. It reminded me, every single morning, exactly how far my parents' sacrifice had carried a boy who used to do his homework in the cab of a truck. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, a pickup ran a red light. I never even saw it come. The doctors told me later that my car rolled twice before it folded against a concrete barrier. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, a traumatic brain injury, and then, on the operating table, a stroke, the kind that reaches into a man and switches off the lights room by room. When I finally surfaced back into the world, my body would not obey a single command I gave it. I could not speak. I could not lift my arms. I could not turn my head to see who was in the room. The machines around my bed made more sound than I could. And in the cruelest joke fate has ever played on me, that silence became the single greatest advantage of my life. Earlier that same morning, before the whispering began, I had heard Dr. Whitmore speaking with my wife just outside the door. The swelling in my brain was improving, he told her. There were signs that I understood more than anyone had first believed. Would I recover, she asked. He could not promise it, he said, but with months of aggressive rehabilitation, patience with determination sometimes surprised everyone. Months. To me that word arrived like a rope lowered into a well. To Eleanor, apparently, it arrived like a bill. She thanked him with a voice that trembled at exactly the right moment. She even cried. I lay there and heard every practiced sniffle, every shaking breath, every note of a performance so flawless it deserved an audience. And the instant the doctor's footsteps faded down the hall, she became a person I did not recognize. And then Bradley arrived, and the two of them stood over me and divided my life like men reading a menu. When at last their footsteps disappeared toward the elevators, the room settled back into its enormous quiet. A minute passed. Then the door opened again softly, and I heard a different kind of step. Unhurried, careful. The step of someone who has learned that sick rooms deserve gentleness. It was not Eleanor. It was not Bradley. It was Nora Bennett, the private nurse my doctors had assigned in the hope that one-on-one care might tilt the odds in my favor. She could not have been much past 35. She had a low, calm voice, and the habit of narrating every small thing she did, the way the best nurses do, even when they assume the patient on the bed cannot hear a word. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hensley," she said. "I'm just going to check your IV." She adjusted the tubing. She glanced at the monitor. And then she went very still, and when she spoke again her voice had dropped to almost nothing. "I know that look," she said. "I think you're awake in there." I poured every ounce of strength I had into widening my eyes, into making them say what my mouth could not. She leaned closer, searching my face the way you'd search a dark window for a shape behind the glass. "Can you understand me?" "Blink once for yes." I blinked once, deliberately. Her eyebrows rose. "Oh." She threw a quick look toward the hallway, then turned back to me. "If you can understand me, blink twice." I blinked. Twice. Her hand froze over the blanket. "My goodness," she whispered, so quietly I nearly lost it under the hum of the machines. "They told me you weren't responding to anything." I blinked again, and I felt the heat of tears gather at the edges of my eyes, and I saw that same heat rise in hers. "Don't worry," she said. "I'm not telling anyone anything, not until we know exactly what you want." Exactly what I wanted. Those 4 words moved through me like warmth returning to a frozen hand. For the first time since the accident, someone was not talking over me, not deciding my future above my head as though I were already gone. Someone was asking me. There was only one problem. I could not answer. Not with a word, not with a whisper, not with the smallest sound. Nora understood my frustration before I could show it. "Can you move anything at all?" she asked. I tried. My fingers refused. My legs had vanished entirely from my awareness, as though they belonged to someone else's body in some other bed. Only my eyes still answered when I called them. And then, out of some deep and dusty corner of memory, an old gift surfaced. My younger sister, Claire, had been born profoundly deaf. Our parents could never have afforded a special school, so instead the whole household learned American Sign Language alongside her, at the kitchen table, night after night. I was 10 years old when I learned my first signs. For years afterward, Claire and I could hold entire conversations across a crowded, noisy room without either of us making a sound. I had not signed regularly in decades. But muscle memory, it turns out, is a patient and forgiving thing. I gathered everything I had and aimed it at my right hand. Nothing. I tried again. Still nothing. And then, at the very end of my strength, the smallest twitch ran through my index finger. Nora saw it. She leaned in. "Try again," she breathed. Pain climbed my arm like fire up a rope. Slowly, agonizingly, my thumb shifted. Then the finger curled. Nora watched me without breathing at all, and then her face broke open. "You're signing," she whispered. "You're trying to sign." Relief flooded through me so completely that I had to close my eyes against it. When I opened them again, she was smiling, and there were tears standing in her lashes. "I know a little ASL," she said. "My younger brother is deaf. Go slow, I'll keep up." It took everything I had, one deliberate movement at a time, to shape a single word. She read it, and her lips parted. "You want your lawyer?" I blinked twice. "Yes." She glanced toward the hall. "Does your family know you can communicate?" One blink. "No." "Do you want them to know?" One blink. "No." She nodded without a flicker of hesitation, without a single question of why. She simply accepted that a man who had lost everything but his mind might have a reason to protect the one thing he had left. "Then I'll help you," she said. That evening Eleanor returned with a bouquet and kissed my forehead and called me sweetheart, and her perfume very nearly made me sick. Bradley trailed in behind her with a coffee and announced that he'd already spoken to the insurance company, that they'd probably fight the rehab costs. And Eleanor sighed and said they'd cross that bridge when they came to it. I lay still, and I almost could have laughed, not because anything was funny, because neither of them had noticed that the bridge had already collapsed beneath their feet. Nora came in to check my medications and never once looked at me any differently. She played her part flawlessly, professional, calm, all but invisible. When at last Eleanor gathered her purse, and Bradley told me to get some rest, and the door closed behind them, Nora waited until their footsteps had faded entirely. Then she drew a small phone from her pocket. "I found the emergency contact listed ahead of your wife," she said quietly. "Arthur Kellerman." She looked at me. "I'm calling him." Arthur Kellerman had been my attorney for 28 years and my friend for just as long. We had built companies together, closed hundreds of deals together. He had helped me write every version of my will since my first wife, Margaret, died of breast cancer nearly 15 years before. When he stepped into my room the next morning in his navy suit, carrying nothing but a worn leather briefcase, and saw my eyes track him across the room, his shoulders dropped an inch, as though he'd been carrying something heavy for days. "My God," he said softly, moving to my bedside. "I came here ready to say goodbye to you." Nora had already told him everything she had witnessed. He knew I could not speak, so she lifted my right hand gently and said, "Mr. Hensley, show him." I concentrated until the effort felt like lifting a truck with one finger, and slowly, painfully, I began to sign. Arthur frowned, and then his eyes went wide. Is that ASL?" Nora nodded. He looked back at me and said one word, "Claire." I blinked twice. He remembered my sister. Everyone who had ever truly known me remembered Claire. Eleanor had never once bothered to learn a single sign. She'd always said she would never have a reason to. Life, it turns out, has a merciless sense of irony. It took nearly 20 minutes to sign my first complete sentence. Nora interpreted patiently. Arthur wrote down every word. The first thing I told them was plain and terrible. "My wife wants me to die." Arthur shook his head at once. "Walter, that's a grave accusation." But I kept going, one exhausting movement after another, and Nora gave my words voice. She told Bradley to cancel my rehabilitation because it costs too much. They stood over this bed and divided my property between them. Slowly, Arthur's face changed. He was no longer skeptical. He knew me. He knew I was not an emotional man, not an impulsive one. If I was accusing someone, I had my reasons. Nora added quietly that she had heard none of it herself, but that the moment she'd found me awake, I had asked for Arthur before I asked for anything else. Arthur removed his glasses and folded them slowly. "Tell me everything," he said. For nearly an hour I signed. Every word Eleanor had whispered. Every sentence Bradley had spoken. Every detail I could drag up out of memory. By the end, Arthur's notebook was full. He leaned back in the little plastic chair. "I've represented wealthy families for over 30 years, he said. "I've watched children sue their parents. I've watched brothers steal each other's inheritance. I've watched partners burn down friendships built over a lifetime." He looked at me. "But this is a different thing. Before we do anything else, we review your estate." He spread documents across the narrow hospital table and began in the flat, methodical voice I had trusted for decades to ask his questions. Had Eleanor ever pressured me into changing the ownership of my companies? One blink. No. Had she become a shareholder again? No. What about the family trust? No. He smiled for the first time that morning. Good. Nora looked lost, so Arthur explained it to her quietly. I had built everything before this marriage. The trust owned the bulk of my major assets: the house, the development companies, the investment properties, the lakefront land. Eleanor lived in those homes. She did not own them. The joint checking account held enough to tempt a person, certainly, but set against the whole of the estate it was, in his words, pocket change. Relief moved through me. Somewhere along the years, some cautious version of myself had protected the man I was about to become. Then Arthur's expression cooled. "But there's another problem." He turned toward me. "If Eleanor genuinely believes you're mentally incapacitated, she may try to secure conservatorship. And once a person controls your medical decisions, they very often gain enormous influence over the financial ones." Nora crossed her arms. "Can she actually do that?" "Not if Walter is mentally competent," Arthur said, "and not if we move first." He began to lay out the options: emergency filings, independent medical evaluations, temporary financial restrictions, protective orders. Everything he said was logical. Everything he said was fast, and yet something in me pushed back. I lifted my hand. Nora watched. "No," I signed. Arthur frowned. "No," I kept going, slow and raw. "Need proof. You already have your own testimony," he said. "Not enough," I answered. He understood. If Eleanor simply denied all of it, the whole thing collapsed into my word against hers. And no jury, no judge, no family member should ever have to sit and wonder which of us was lying. I did not want a quiet legal victory that left a permanent question mark hanging over my name. I wanted the truth exposed so completely, so undeniably, that no one could ever rewrite it. Arthur leaned back and slowly he smiled. "I think I know exactly what you're planning." Around 10:30, Eleanor swept in carrying homemade blueberry muffins, beaming at everyone. "Oh, Arthur, I didn't know you'd be here." He stood politely and said he'd wanted to look in on an old friend. She dabbed at an imaginary tear. "It's just heartbreaking. I don't know what I'd do without him." I watched the whole performance from my pillow. If there were an award for a grieving spouse, she'd have earned the nomination. Bradley wandered in behind her, wearing sunglasses indoors, and barely glanced my way. Instead, he turned to Arthur. "So, how's all the legal stuff coming?" Arthur answered lightly that there was nothing to discuss. Bradley shrugged. "Guess we'll wait then." Exactly, I thought. They would wait, because they still believed I was sealed inside a broken body with no way left to fight. As Nora adjusted my IV, our eyes met for less than a second. No smile, no signal. Nothing anyone else in that room could have caught. But I knew the game had begun. They had been careless with their whispering for one reason, and it was a reason I came to understand only later. They believed the room was safe. They believed the man in the bed was already gone, and they believed no one who mattered was listening to a dying developer and his tired nurse. Arrogance makes people loud. It was the single most useful mistake they ever made. That afternoon, after Eleanor and Bradley left for lunch, Nora returned with my tablet. I had always run a full security system across my properties, a habit of a man who'd spent his life around unfinished, unlocked buildings, and she had quietly linked the tablet to it. A notification sat waiting on the screen. Motion detected. Location, home office. Nora's face tightened. She looked at me, then signed slowly, "Someone is taking documents from your house." I stared at the screen a long moment, and then, despite the pain tearing up my arm, I signed 2 words. She swallowed. "You want me to let them?" I blinked twice. She nodded slowly and repeated my answer aloud, as though testing the weight of it. "Let them. Because sometimes the fastest way to catch a thief is to let him believe that no one, anywhere, is watching." By the end of that first week, everyone had settled comfortably into the version of me they wanted. The doctors saw a patient inching forward after a catastrophe. Eleanor saw a husband who would never again question a credit card statement. Bradley saw an inheritance with a faint, inconvenient pulse. Only 3 people on Earth knew the truth: Nora, Arthur, and me. That illusion became the sharpest weapon I owned. The following Monday, Arthur arrived looking almost cheerful. He'd spent the weekend going through everything. "Walter," he said, closing the door behind him, "you built your empire like a man who never once trusted luck." He opened his folders: 23 limited liability companies, 4 holding companies, the family trust, 3 separate investment partnerships. Nora's eyebrows climbed. "Most people don't realize," Arthur told her. Then to me, "You always said one lawsuit should never be able to erase a lifetime of work." I remembered saying exactly that, 20 years earlier. Back then it had sounded like the caution of an anxious man. Now it was the thing keeping me alive. "Eleanor only has unrestricted access to the joint household account," he went on. "Everything else requires your approval." I blinked twice. Good. Then his smile faded, but someone has already tried. He slid a document across the bedside table. Nora picked it up and frowned. "A request to transfer corporate voting rights." "Who filed this?" "A law firm," Arthur said evenly. "Not mine. They claim your condition has left you permanently incompetent." My heartbeat lurched. Nora looked ill. "They've been in this hospital 1 week." Arthur nodded. "Exactly. That's far faster than grieving families move." I raised my hand, one grinding movement at a time. "Who hired them?" He sighed. "We're confirming it, but I have a very strong suspicion." Neither of us needed to say her name aloud. That evening, Arthur brought a stranger, a silver-haired woman in jeans, boots, and a navy blazer. "This is Denise Calloway," he said. "Licensed private investigator. She's worked with me for years." Denise gave me a small nod. "I don't believe in coincidences," she said. "And your wife has already developed a routine." Denise opened a slim notebook. "Every morning, a coffee shop, a fitness club, the hospital. Every afternoon, a string of unexplained meetings downtown. Every evening, dinner with Bradley." She turned a page. Yesterday they had met with a luxury realtor. They had toured my house. She slid photographs across the table. Eleanor standing on the front lawn, laughing. Bradley pointing toward the detached garage. The 2 of them walking through my home beside a well-dressed couple, while the realtor carried a roll of blueprints. My stomach twisted. They were not waiting for me to die. They were already planning the renovations. Over the next several days, Denise's file grew heavier. Bradley ordered custom furniture. Eleanor met twice with a financial advisor she had never used before. A moving company came out to the house on the excuse of future remodeling. Meanwhile, no one visited me but Nora and Arthur. Eleanor shortened her visits from an hour to 30 minutes, then to 20. One afternoon she stayed less than 8, kissed my forehead, murmured that she missed my smile, and left. Nora looked at me. Neither of us said a word. We didn't need to. There was exactly one thing Eleanor never once thought to ask about: my rehabilitation. Because she assumed it wasn't happening. Officially, it wasn't. Unofficially, Nora had arranged something else entirely. Every evening, after visiting hours ended and the ward went quiet, she wheeled in a physical therapist named Gordon Reyes. Gordon had retired from the Veterans Hospital System 2 years earlier, and Nora trusted him without reservation. "So," he said at our first session, arms folded, "I hear you're stubborn." I blinked twice. Nora laughed. That's his way of saying yes. The work was brutal. My fingers cramped. My shoulder burned. Every attempt to move my left leg felt like dragging wet concrete uphill. More than once I wanted to quit. Gordon never once let me. "You built neighborhoods," he said, tapping my forearm. "So build this. One muscle, one movement." For a day or two I hated him for it. Then, somewhere in the second week, I started to believe him. 2 weeks in, I could lift 3 fingers. My right arm answered more reliably. One afternoon, I managed a crooked half smile, and Nora clapped as though I'd won an Olympic medal. "That's huge," she laughed. "You have no idea." But I did. Every tiny gain meant the same thing. Eleanor's window was closing. Mine was opening wider by the day. One Friday evening, Denise arrived with a small flash drive. "I think you'll want to see this." Arthur plugged it into a laptop, and security footage filled the screen. A private dining room in an upscale Charlotte steakhouse, filmed from a hidden angle. At first there was no sound, then the audio caught up. Eleanor lifted a wine glass. "Honestly," she said, "I thought he'd die that first night." Bradley laughed. "So did I." A third voice, the realtor most likely, asked what happened if I recovered. Eleanor shrugged. "He won't. The doctor said rehab takes months." And Bradley, leaning back in his chair, said, "And we're making sure that never happens." Silence swallowed my hospital room. Denise folded her arms. "I've already preserved copies." No one spoke. I stared at the frozen frame on the screen, and I felt every doubt I'd ever nursed simply dissolve. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice, made again and again and again. Denise reached into her folder one last time. "There's one more." She pressed a key, and a second recording began, this one from a camera inside my own home office. Eleanor stood beside my desk, believing herself alone. She smiled to herself, and then softly she said the sentence that ended whatever was left. "The sooner he dies," she said, glancing toward the door where Bradley waited, "the sooner we're free." No one in the room moved, not even Nora. Arthur closed the laptop slowly. He looked at me for a long moment. "Walter," he said, "I think we have all the proof we'll ever need." I looked at him, then at Nora, and I raised my trembling hand. One sign, not yet, because I was not interested in winning quietly. I wanted the truth, dragged all the way out into the light. After that, I stopped measuring time in dates, and started measuring it in victories. The first time I lifted my right hand without help. The first time I stood, for 5 whole seconds, beside the bed. The first time I swallowed without coughing. Each of them was invisible to everyone but the people who truly cared. And Nora celebrated every single one. Gordon pushed me through every step. Arthur, meanwhile, quietly laid the legal foundation beneath us all. One Tuesday, before sunrise, Gordon wheeled me into the empty rehab room. "Today's the day," he said. "You're walking." My legs did not agree. The parallel bars looked a mile apart. He locked the wheelchair. "Stand." Nora slid an arm around my back. Gordon braced my shoulder. I pushed. Nothing. Again. Every muscle in my body protested. And then my knees straightened for the first time since the accident. I was standing, only for a moment, but I was standing. "One step," Gordon said, pointing. "Just one." My right foot moved barely 6 inches. Then my left. Pain exploded through my hip. Sweat ran into my eyes. I nearly folded. Gordon caught me. "What did I tell you?" I took another step, then another. When we reached the end of the bars, Nora was crying openly. "I've watched miracles before," she whispered, "but never one this stubborn." The evidence, meanwhile, kept arriving. Bradley had listed items online. Antique furniture, a grand piano, Margaret's crystal collection, things that had never for 1 second belonged to Eleanor. My late wife had spent years gathering that crystal, each piece tied to a trip we'd taken together. Bradley saw only dollar signs. Then Arthur handed Nora another document. A reservation at a funeral home. Eleanor had met with them the day before and planned the service, down to the expensive flowers and the luxury limousines and the premium catering. Everything except love. I closed my eyes, not from grief, but because I suddenly remembered a promise Margaret and I had made each other long ago, that whoever went first, there would be music and stories and laughter. a celebration of a life, not a performance of a loss. That evening, Arthur unfolded a fresh set of papers. I think it's time. For nearly an hour, we worked through every document, my answers coming through signs and through sentences typed slowly on a tablet. The first was a new will. Eleanor remained in it, for exactly $1. Bradley received the same. Nora looked uneasy. Isn't that harsh? I typed my answer. $1 proves I didn't forget them. Arthur smiled. Exactly. If they ever claim they were accidentally left out, this ends that argument before it starts. The next papers moved gifts to where they belonged. Scholarships for nursing students, funding for rehabilitation centers, a trust for families who couldn't afford long-term therapy. Why? Nora asked. I typed, because no one else should lose hope over money. Her eyes filled again. Then Arthur slid a cream-colored invitation across the table. The Hensley Family Foundation Annual Gala. Every October, my foundation held a fundraising dinner in Charlotte. Business owners, teachers, city officials, scholarship recipients, veterans, hospital administrators, close to 400 guests. Eleanor had already announced publicly that I would not be attending. She intended to accept an award on my behalf. Bradley planned to introduce himself as the foundation's future chairman. Arthur leaned forward. I've confirmed they've both accepted. Denise grinned. They're already rehearsing their speeches. Nora shook her head. They really don't know you. Arthur looked directly at me. Walter, are you absolutely certain you want to do this in public? I didn't hesitate. I raised my hand and signed deliberately. Truth deserves witnesses. The room fell quiet. Denise finally broke it. I've investigated wealthy people for 22 years. Most of them want revenge. She looked at me. You want accountability. I nodded because there is a difference and it matters. Revenge only feeds the anger that made it. Accountability protects the next person in line. If Eleanor and Bradley could betray a husband and a father this easily, who else would they one day sit beside and quietly ruin? The gala was still weeks away, and I needed every one of them. My recovery did not arrive like a lightning strike. It came the way everything real comes, slowly and against resistance. Week by week, the distance I could walk with a cane grew a little longer. My speech therapist began letting me practice single words. The first word I managed wasn't help. It wasn't pain. It wasn't even my own name. It was no. Nora laughed when she heard it. That seems about right. It was. For weeks, my entire life had been defined by that one quiet syllable. No to surrender, no to fear, no to letting greed rewrite my legacy while I lay still and let it happen. By the night of the gala, I was still far from whole. I could stand. I could walk slowly with a cane at my side. My voice came out rough and broken and slow. But it came out, and that was all I needed. The evening arrived at the Ashcroft Hotel in downtown Charlotte, and the ballroom filled with nearly 400 people. Business leaders, doctors, teachers, the construction supervisors who had worked beside me for decades, a few city council members, several reporters, even Dr. Whitmore and members of the rehabilitation team. Eleanor arrived in a long black designer gown, elegant and expensive and very nearly appropriate for a widow. Bradley followed in a tailored tuxedo, shaking hands, introducing himself to anyone important enough to matter. I'm Walter Hensley's stepson, he said, smiling. I'll be taking over a great deal of his responsibilities. A few people congratulated him. Those who truly knew me found the statement strangely, coldly premature. Denise stood near the back, pretending to check her phone. Arthur chatted with board members. Nora waited at a corner table in a navy dress, plainly uncomfortable among the donors. When she spotted me in the service corridor, she smiled. You ready? I drew a slow breath. My cane was firm in my right hand. I've been ready, I said. The words rough, imperfect, but mine. She squeezed my shoulder. I never thought 3 words could make me cry. Inside, Eleanor stepped onto the stage to polite applause and accepted the microphone with practiced grief. I wish Walter could be here tonight, she said. As many of you know, his condition remains very serious. Our family is grateful for your prayers. Bradley nodded solemnly from the front row. And although Walter may never fully, the ballroom door opened. No one noticed at first. Then someone near the back gasped. Heads began to turn, one after another, like a row of dominoes going down, and the silence spread outward across the room until it reached the stage. Eleanor stopped speaking. Bradley turned around, and the color drained straight out of his face. I stepped into the ballroom, one careful step at a time. My cane touched the polished floor. Click, another step, click. Each small sound rang through the hush like a struck bell. Eleanor's face lost every trace of color. "Walter," she breathed. Bradley looked as though he'd seen a ghost. "That's impossible," he whispered. I kept walking, slowly, deliberately, not for effect, but because that was simply the speed I had. Nora stayed a few feet behind me. Arthur moved quietly toward the stage. When I finally reached the front, I looked at Eleanor, and then at Bradley, and neither of them could hold my eyes. I took the microphone. For a long moment, I simply stood there, and the whole room waited. Then I spoke. The word came out strained, cracked. I took another breath. Tears were already standing in Eleanor's eyes. No one moved. No one so much as coughed. I heard my wife cancel my rehab. Eleanor stumbled backward. "Walter, please." I raised a single finger and she stopped. I heard my stepson claim my house. Bradley shook his head frantically. "You're twisting things." Arthur stepped up onto the stage. "I wouldn't recommend interrupting," he said, and his voice carried clean across the ballroom. "Especially considering what's about to be shown." A large projection screen lowered behind us. Arthur nodded to the technician, and the first video began. Hospital hallway security footage, Eleanor entering my room, Bradley following, the timestamp and date plain in the corner. The room stayed silent as the subtitles appeared beneath the image. "Cancel his rehab, save the money." A collective gasp swept the ballroom. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "That recording is illegal." Denise stood. "No. It was lawfully obtained under hospital security procedures, after concerns were raised about potential financial exploitation of a vulnerable patient." Eleanor's eyes darted to Bradley. He looked ready to bolt. The second recording started. The steakhouse, the wine glasses, the laughter. "The doctor said rehab takes months, and we're making sure that never happens." Somewhere in the crowd a voice whispered, "Oh my God." Then the third began. My home office, Eleanor alone beside my desk. "The sooner he dies, the sooner we're free." Several board members lowered their heads. An elderly woman near the front, who had known Margaret and me since the very beginning, began to cry quietly. Bradley pointed at me. "He's setting us up." Arthur calmly lifted another folder. Bank records, another. Forged authorization requests. Denise added her own. The attempted transfer of corporate voting rights. The phone records, the property listings, the moving company contracts. Nora came and stood beside me without a word, exactly where she'd stood since the first day she believed me. Eleanor finally broke. She dropped to her knees. "Walter, I'm sorry, I was scared. I didn't know what to do." I looked down at her, and for one brief moment I remembered the woman I had married. The vacations, the quiet evenings on the porch, the birthday dinners, the Christmas mornings. And then I remembered the hospital room, her hand holding mine, her whisper, "Cancel his rehab." Fear does not explain that. Only greed does. Bradley tried a final angle. "This is all about money." I shook my head slowly. "No." My voice came out stronger than it had all night. "It's about trust." He opened his mouth again, but before he could speak, two detectives walked into the ballroom. No uniforms, just dark suits, professional and calm. One of them crossed to Arthur, who handed over a thick evidence binder. The detective nodded and turned to Bradley. "Mr. Bradley Whitfield, we need to speak with you regarding allegations of fraud, attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and document forgery." Bradley's face went white. Eleanor stared. "What?" The second detective looked at her. "Mrs. Hensley, we'll need to speak with you as well." The ballroom stayed completely silent. No applause, no celebration. Just the truth, raw and unavoidable. As the detectives led them toward a private conference room, Bradley looked back at me one last time, and his eyes were full of hatred. Mine held something else entirely. Sadness. Because for all of it, this was not the ending I had once imagined for my family. Nora stepped up beside me. "You okay?" I looked around the ballroom, at the men who had helped me build neighborhoods, at the scholarship students, the nurses, the veterans, the families, and I smiled. For the first time in weeks, it wasn't forced. Arthur came to my other side. "Is it over?" I asked him. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "but justice has finally begun. People imagine that revenge ends the instant the guilty are exposed. It doesn't. That night at the gala was not the ending. It was the beginning of everything that came after. The investigations, the lawsuits, the apologies, and, slowest of all, the healing. Justice, I learned, moves far more slowly than anger, but it lasts a great deal longer. The weeks that followed blurred together into attorneys and appointments. Every morning, Gordon still insisted I walk a little farther than the day before. "You've got another lap in you," he'd say. "I don't. You do." He'd grin. You sound stronger every time you argue with me. And one morning, for the first time in over a month, I laughed. A real laugh. Not because life had become easy, but because it finally felt like life again. There he is, Nora said. The stubborn man everyone kept warning me about. The legal process moved quickly once the evidence became public. The hospital recordings, the footage from my office, the forged documents, the attempted transfer of voting rights, the financial records. Together they painted a picture no jury could ignore. Eleanor was charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, conspiracy to commit fraud, and several related offenses. Bradley faced additional charges tied to the forged documents and the attempted theft. Neither was charged with wishing me dead. People are free to think terrible things. The law punishes actions, and they had taken plenty of those. Within 2 months, Bradley also lost his real estate license. The board reviewed the evidence on its own and found what was left of his integrity wanting. One afternoon, Arthur walked into my office carrying a familiar folder, except this time it wasn't a hospital room. I was back at Hensley Development behind my own desk. The room looked exactly as I'd left it. The framed photograph of Margaret beside my computer, the wooden model of the first neighborhood we'd ever built together still on the shelf. Nothing had changed but me. "You look good sitting there," Arthur said. "I've missed it," I told him, and my speech, though slow, was steadier every week. He set the folder down. "The criminal cases are moving toward plea agreements." I nodded. I'd expected that. "There's something else," he said, and hesitated. "Eleanor wants to see you." 3 weeks later, I agreed, not because she deserved another chance, but because I deserved peace. We met in a quiet counseling office downtown, neutral ground, no lawyers and no cameras. Eleanor looked older than I remembered, not in her face but in the way she held herself. The effortless confidence was simply gone. "I almost didn't come," she admitted. "I almost didn't either." She said she'd rehearsed the conversation 100 times. So had I. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. "I already have," I answered. Her eyes widened. "I forgave you for my sake, not yours. If I carried the hatred, you'd still be running my life." Tears ran down her cheeks. She said she knew she'd been greedy, that somewhere along the way she'd stopped seeing me as her husband and started seeing me as an opportunity. The words hurt, not because they were new, but because they were finally honest. She took my old wedding ring from her purse and tried to hand it back. I placed it gently on the table between us. "You keep it," I said. "It belongs to your memories, too." There was nothing left to say. As we stood, she whispered that she hoped one day I'd remember something good about her. "I already do," I told her. And then I walked away, not because forgiveness had erased anything, because it never could, but because I no longer needed to carry it. A month later, a handwritten letter arrived from Bradley, sent from the court-ordered rehabilitation program that was part of his sentence. The first line surprised me. "I spent my whole life chasing things that belonged to other people, because I never built anything of my own." There were no excuses in it, no blaming Eleanor, no blaming me, only regret. Arthur asked if I meant to answer it. "I don't know," I said. Nora smiled. "You don't have to decide today." She was right. Some wounds heal quickly. Others deserve time. 6 months after leaving the hospital, I made the biggest decision of my life. I sold the house on the lake. Everyone assumed I did it because it reminded me of betrayal. They were wrong. The house reminded me of success. But success no longer needed 4 stories and a lakefront view. Home was never the building. Home was the people inside it. So I bought a modest place 20 minutes away. 3 bedrooms, a small dock, a wide front porch where I could watch the sun come up over a cup of coffee. Nora visited often. Gordon came by on weekends to make sure I kept moving. Arthur and I started fishing again. For the first time in years, my calendar wasn't full, but my heart was. The foundation changed, too. Instead of expanding luxury housing, we built 2 new programs: rehabilitation grants for stroke and accident survivors whose insurance couldn't cover long-term therapy, and scholarships for nursing students committed to compassionate care. At the dedication ceremony, I asked Nora to stand beside me. "I hate microphones," she hissed. "You'll survive," I said. When she reluctantly stepped forward, I handed her a plaque, and she covered her mouth when she read it. "The Nora Bennett Compassionate Care Scholarship. You named it after me? You reminded me that healing starts the moment someone chooses to believe you." There wasn't a dry eye in the room, least of all mine. People still ask me whether I regret exposing Eleanor and Bradley. My answer always surprises them. No, I only regret that they ever gave me a reason to. because revenge was never the goal. The accident took my voice for a while, but in exchange it gave me something rarer and more valuable, the ability to see people exactly as they were. Some of them walked away. Some of them stayed. And the difference between those two groups changed the rest of my life. I want to stay here a moment longer, because I've come to believe that what happened to me is not nearly as unusual as it should be. What I lived through has a name that most people never hear until it lands in their own family. The financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. It happens quietly in ordinary houses to ordinary people. The newly widowed, the recently diagnosed, the aging, the injured. Anyone whose guard has been lowered by illness or grief. It rarely arrives as an obvious villain. Far more often it wears the face of someone who is supposed to love you. And it begins not with theft, but with a small, reasonable-sounding suggestion. Cancel his rehab, it's pointless. We'll cross that bridge later. The cruelty of it is that the victim is usually the last to be believed, precisely because they are the least able to speak. If my story is useful for anything beyond an evening's attention, let it be this. Watch for the quiet signs. A sudden interest in someone's accounts, a new eagerness to make decisions for their own good. A caretaker who works to keep the vulnerable person isolated and alone. When you see someone silenced by circumstance, do not assume there is no one behind the silence. Ask them. Wait for the answer, however slowly it comes. A nurse named Nora once looked at a man everyone else had already written off and decided, against every convenient assumption, that there was still a mind and a will inside that broken body. That single act of belief is the only reason I am alive to tell you any of this, and to anyone lying in a bed of your own tonight. A hospital bed, or a harder kind that has no rails. I want you to hear the one thing this whole ordeal taught me. Your worth was never in the house, or the accounts, or the title on the door. Never measure your wealth by the size of what you own. Measure it by the people who stay, when they believe you have nothing left to give. Those are the ones worth building a life around. Everything else is just brick and mortar. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone you love, or steadied you toward choosing integrity, even when integrity is the harder road, I would truly love to hear your thoughts. Your stories matter as much as mine. And if you'd like to walk alongside me for more stories about resilience, justice, forgiveness, and the stubborn strength of the human spirit, I'd be honored if you subscribed to my channel and came back for the next journey. Until then, take good care of yourself, and never let hardship convince you that your story is over. Sometimes the quietest voice in the room turns out to carry the loudest truth of all. Everything you've just heard was written, shaped, and told by a human being. A person who has sat with real people through real grief and real recovery, and who believes these stories deserve to be handled with care rather than manufactured. The names here are invented, and the events are dramatized, but the emotions underneath them are not. They were drawn from a lifetime of watching how ordinary people endure the unthinkable, and how, more often than we ever expect, they find their way back to the light. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.